Okay, so now we are beginning the new topic, which is the colonial crisis leading to the American Revolution. And the years of this topic span from 1763 through 1789, which is the year that the United States ratified its second constitution, which is the constitution we have today, of course. And arguably, this is the most important topic in the course alongside racialized slavery in Virginia. And later we'll discuss the legacies of the American Revolution, and this will become clear to you as to why this is the case. But by now, students should have a firm historical background of how the colonial experience is going to lead to the decision to break from the mother country of England. And let me just say this, in 1763, virtually no one, none of our leaders, let alone the common person, did not foresee this event happening, nor did they wish that until, let's call it the midnight hour, so to say, the last hour when our leaders finally decided to break with the mother country, and they were spurred in large degree by the common person. This is a topic we'll discuss later in the topic. But the point being that through these years, it was not sort of the handwriting on the wall, so to say, that the American Revolution was going to happen. This momentous event of the colonies breaking free and declaring independence from the mother country. Okay, so by now, students should have this firm background, like I said, and we discussed from the beginning, how settlement patterns that were undertaken and established by the British in the New World were quite different from earlier Europeans in many regards, and how there was various push and pull factors leading to English migration, how in the beginning these if you will, backwoods assemblies were precariously hanging in the balance in terms of survival. But eventually you see them stabilize, and not only stabilize, but become, as I mentioned, important capital or actually commercial centers for the English Empire by the 18th century, that is. And therefore we see prosperity and more widespread prosperity and ownership of land and consumerism, that is to say, compared to the mother country of England. And let's also recall that the overarching theme of decentralization, right, not only in religious life, but certainly in politics, how, whereby in the case of the colonies, all politics is local, how that attitude is going to figure prominently in their reaction to Parliament and even the King after 1763, whereby Parliament is going to try to impose more forceful measures, especially economic measures, through the years of colonial crisis upon the North American colonies. And we'll discuss the reasons why they have to do this. And of course, the colonial response would be one of repudiation and one of rejection and defiance, ultimately leading again to July 4th. So this spans, a lot of years, 13 years between 1763 and July 4th, 1776. And this is exactly what we call the colonial crisis. All right, so we have that solid background, and therefore it leads us to the big questions that we could think of now that we have this solid background. These are big questions that perhaps we should save until the end of this topic. We'll revisit it again, but let me introduce them. The first question is, what kind of revolution was the American Revolution? And believe it or not, this is kind of difficult to answer. It's certainly contentious among historians themselves. When you think about what a revolution is, well, let me at this point set up a distinction between revolution versus reform. in the latter case, a reform is not institutional change. It doesn't involve replacing institutions with another different institution. Rather, you are trying to preserve the present institutions, and what you're trying to do is, due to certain deficiencies or certain, you know, certain certain flaws in the institution, what you want to do is try to correct those deficiencies, those flaws. In other words, you're trying to make it better. You're reforming it. And that's opposed to a revolution, which is much more drastic. What's happening in a revolution is you're actually replacing one institution with a different one. Okay, so of course, there's all kinds of revolutions in the history of humankind. There's social revolutions, political revolutions, economic revolutions. In fact, in the case of economic revolution, one big theme in this course, as I've said time and time again, is the transition from feudalism to capitalism, right? That's a slow historical revolution, but it is still a revolution. And then there's cultural revolutions as well. And, most people think that, or think of political revolutions in human history, especially in modern times. For example, the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, right? The revolution in China during the 20th century, and so many others. But when we compare the American Revolution with other revolutions, especially political revolutions, we realize that it's a different type of revolution. For example, was it a social revolution? Well, when we think about that, it's hard to say, because we already remarked that even in the colonial era, before the revolution, there was already a respectable amount of fluidity and even upward mobility within the ranks, say, of the social stratification system, right? So, in other words, there was no pure feudalism in the colonies. So that was true before 1776, and it's certainly true after, and it's true today, right? So there was no revolution in terms of social ranks, right, or social ranking. Was it a political revolution? Well, in one aspect, that is correct, because what we're doing is repudiating, again, the authority of Parliament and even the king. But when you think about it, that's been the case since the beginning of English settlement. Think about, for example, the policy of salutary neglect. That was the case where Parliament decided to leave the colonies alone and leave them to their own devices, so to say, and let them thrive and prosper, and hopefully that'll be beneficial for the English Empire, right? That was the whole objective of salutary neglect. So, in other words, this idea of being independent, apart from the authority of Parliament, was already there before the revolution, right? Also, when you think about leadership, usually a political revolution entails a drastic change in terms of who are the leaders, right? For example, in the French Revolution, if you know anything about that, it entailed the transfer of power from the king to the common person, called the bourgeoisie. And in fact, they literally, cut off the head of the king, right, and the guillotine, and Marie Antoinette as well, his wife. That's very symbolic as well as literal, right? It means that you reject monarchy. But do we see that happening with our political vanguard of leadership before the revolution compared to after? No, it's the same leaders, and what we like to call our founding fathers, right? The same before the revolution, the same after. So it's not really not clearly a political revolution. Economic? No, that's not true either, because as I, again, keep mentioning throughout the course, there is no pure feudalism. You don't see a transition from feudalism to capitalism. It's been commercial since the beginning. Think, for example, of joint stock companies and the Virginia Company, right? And the Massachusetts Bay Company. So it's in many ways a commercial venture from the very beginning. That is to say, English settlement, right, was a commercial venture, and also other things we acknowledge like religious settlements and so forth. Okay, so the final one is the Cultural Revolution, and this is surprising because many historians of this period, that is to say, those who focus on the revolution, those who are writing about the American Revolution even today, are inclined to emphasize the revolution as a cultural one, believe it or not. Okay, more so than social, political, or economic. And again, I'll make that more clear towards the end of this topic. All right, the next big question is, which side was more right in this dispute? The American side or the British? Now, for this question, I always ask students to hold in abeyance, if they will, suspend, that is, their tendencies or their inclination to, side with the American side. That seems almost, you know, a tendency that we can't help as Americans. And in fact, it's probably a tendency that's been buttressed by, the education that received in maybe high school, history or what have you, let alone your own reading, what you, may have encountered online, when you see slogans, right, that say, give me liberty or give me death, right? It makes the British sound like oppressors and the Americans sound like victims. But here's the thing. Was that really the case? Okay, so again, throughout this topic, I want students to try to be objective, to make up their own mind as we discuss this. All right, which side was more correct? Now, kind of related to all this was the American Revolution inevitable? And again, when we invoke those slogans like "Don't tread on me" or "Give me liberty" or "Give me death," when you think about that phrase in itself, that's what you could call a either or proposition, right? You either do this or that's going to happen, right? So that slogan suggests that. It suggests that, either I have my freedom or I gain my freedom or someone is going to die, right? And there's no gray area in between, no middle ground, according to that either or proposition. But was that the case? And I kind of hinted at this earlier, that our founders, let alone most of the commoners, were very hesitant to declare independence even after hostilities erupted. That is to say, the first battles between the colonials and the British Army. For example, Lexington and Concord and even Bunker Hill. Our founders, in fact, were very proud to be British, and they did not want to relinquish their status as English subjects. So we have to ask ourselves, right? Was the American Revolution meant to happen? If, for example, and this is a contingent way of thinking, what if the king intervened on behalf of the colonials rather than Parliament? Then, the American Revolution would have never happened. And the founders would have been happy. They would have been, in fact, relieved. Wow, that was close. We almost lost our status as English subjects, right? And by the way, I'll make that more clear again later. I keep saying that, right? But I'm kind of previewing what we're going to discuss here with the big questions, so to say. And then finally, what were the legacies of the American Revolution? I kind of hinted at this earlier. The legacies are quite numerous and widespread. And let me just give you one one picture, if you will, to form in your mind about the legacy of the American Revolution, not just in American history, but world history. Um, Once we were victorious with the American Revolutionary War, and our status as an independent republic was pretty much guaranteed. And by the way, this officially won't happen until 1783. Once that happens, we are the first major republic in modern history. Now, when you look at the vast expanse of world history itself, sure, there were some republics in, the times of antiquity, even, the Roman Republic you may have heard of. In fact, there was some democracy in Athens, right? But in the modern world, we're the first republic. And let me remind you what republicanism refers to. It means the rejection of monarchy or emperor systems. And rather, it's revolutionary insofar as you want it, that rulership to be replaced by rule of the people, right? Now, there were some pre-existing republics, very small ones in Europe, around the Italian city-states, for example, or areas of what we call Switzerland today. But the United States of America would become the first major republic. Now, other places were, in other words, emperorships or, monarchies. Well, look at the world today. The last time I checked, there were only 4 or 5 monarchies left. And when I say monarchies, I mean kings and queens that actually rule or legislate in their country. There are some monarchies, for example, in England or some Scandinavian countries, in Thailand, so forth, but they no longer legislate. They no longer rule. They're more symbolic or even cultural, right? They represent, if you will, the spirit of the people, but they're not rulers. Okay, rather, what you see today in contemporary times are republics, right? Last time I checked again, I think up to 200 republics exist in the world today, and only 4 or 5 legitimate monarchs that rule. So look at that. It turned it upside down from 1776 to, let's say, 2020. The whole world system in terms of political arrangements is turned upside down, emulating America. So if you want to argue a case for American exceptionalism, here is a strong argument you could make, right? And of course, it's all connected with the legacy of the American Revolution. So again, there's other important legacies that we'll discuss, but I have to say this is one of the biggest ones, right? The idea of republicanism in modern times. Okay, so now we're going to move to the next video.